Good morning, everybody. We're going to give it a couple more minutes for everybody to log in. I just wanted you all to know that we are here and make sure that your audio is working.
Looks like we're at 10 a.m. Does it make sense to get
Yeah.
started, Melissa?
Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone. I know we have people from all over the world joining us today, and so we're very excited to welcome Dr. Natalie Saaris and Actively Learn to show us how we can deepen reading comprehension using writing and this platform. My name is Melissa Lazaro. I'm with Lexplore, and if you're not familiar with Lexplore, Lexplore is a rapid reading assessment. We use AI and eye tracking to determine a child's reading ability. And with the power of eye tracking, we can now understand a child's silent reading ability, which is really exciting. So we are the leaders in science of reading, and we offer a lot of free tools. And one of the services that we offer is educational webinars that are free to the community of parents and teachers and educators that are out there. And we're just so excited to have Dr. Natalie Saaris here today. She is the VP of Marketing and Product at Actively Learn. She has her PhD from Harvard and has spent her educational career studying literature, linguistics, and language. And so today she'll be sharing how we can help our students become better writers and readers. And I know Natalie has a few housekeeping items, maybe answering some initial questions that you might have at the beginning, like, is this going to be recorded? And how do I ask a question? You don't need to raise your hand virtually in the Zoom platform. Any question that you have, you will want to put in the Q&A, and you might want to mark whether you want that to be anonymous or you want your name attached, or if you'd like it to be a global question. We will reserve some of the more common questions for the end, so those will be answered for everybody to hear. But we do have Tessa from Actively Learn today with us, who will be moderating our Q&A. So without further ado, Dr. Natalie Saaris, please go ahead.
All right. Thank you for being here today, everybody. Yes, so I am currently the Vice President of Product and Marketing at Actively Learn, which is a digital curriculum platform. I'm also a former high school and college teacher. And in my earlier role at Actively Learn, I was the Senior Manager of Research. And so I developed micro-credentials, I wrote white papers, blog posts, and crafted frameworks around deeper learning and literacy. So today we're really going to be talking about the role of writing in reading comprehension. And to start out, I thought it would be kind of helpful to craft and outline a little bit of a framework about how writing really impacts reading comprehension and how those two work together. So first, we can think of writing as a way to make thinking visible. So typically, when students are reading, their eyes are scanning text on a page. It's hard to know what their brain is actually doing. How are they interacting with those ideas? Are they making sense of them? And so one way to think of writing is just to get into students' brains and know what's happening. And typically for us in the classroom, that takes the role of assessment, either formative or summative. Another way to think of writing is a means to transform structure and organize ideas. So here, writing is actually is really guiding the learning process. So anytime you're using a graphic organizer in your classroom to help students kind of structure main ideas and kind of show how the different parts of the text come together, that's a means of using writing to learn. Third, writing is just a way to record ideas. We can think of this in terms of metacognition. And so when students are outlining their thinking and their learning strategies and then looking over them and seeing what's working for them and what isn't, anytime students are taking notes and then referring back to them as they're studying, or anytime students are just writing down things, like maybe they're taking notes as you're speaking during your lecture, just so they can remember them better. One of the things we know about writing is anytime students write something down, they're more likely to retain it. And lastly, writing is just a way to share ideas in an asynchronous way. So many of you have been teaching remotely since this spring. And so you may have been using Google Docs or Actively Learn or another collaborative tool just to get students to share their ideas and respond to one another. And we're certainly going to be talking about that today. So now that we have a bit of a framework in place, I want to get to some strategies that you can use to deepen comprehension using writing. And the first strategy applies to that scenario of just making thinking visible in the service of assessment. So strategy number one, ask questions that require students to transform what they've read, meaning put ideas into their own words, construct arguments. So ideally, when you're asking students questions, you're asking them questions that they cannot respond to using copy and paste. You want them to take the ideas that they're interacting with and somehow make them their own. The big teacher benefit of this approach is that you have a much better sense of what students actually understand and where their misconceptions lie. So if students are pulling ideas from the text verbatim, we don't know if they understand the meaning of those words on that page. So getting them to actually rephrase and interact with those ideas in a unique way gives us a better understanding of their comprehension. And then the student benefit is that the more that content is manipulated, the more likely it is to be remembered and understood. There was a pretty cool study done in the 80s where researchers had students read a passage, and I want to say it was a nonfiction social studies passage, and then they had them do one of four things. So one group of students read the passage and were just told to study it. So they were not asked to do any kind of writing. The second group of students had to answer a series of comprehension questions, and those were evenly spread between textually implicit and textually explicit, meaning that in some instances, students had to answer very basic kind of rote questions about what they'd read, and in other instances, they had to actually infer a meaning. The third group had to write a 200 to 250 word summary about what they had read. And that last group had to do some analytic writing, meaning they had to actually defend a particular interpretation based on the text. And what's interesting is that the analytic group actually wrote the least amount of words. So they wrote fewer words than the comprehension question group or the summary writing group. And the idea behind the study was that the researchers were thinking about this question of manipulating ideas and what impact it has on learning. So if you think about the read and study group, that group is doing the least amount of restructuring and manipulating ideas because they're not writing anything. The comprehension question group is doing more manipulating and transforming ideas because they're looking at, particular parts of the passage that we're focusing them on and having to respond to questions. The summary group is even doing more because they have to, on their own, transform ideas in their own words, figure out, what was important here, how does it fit together? And the analytic writing group is doing the most transformation and manipulation of textual ideas because they have to actually craft an argument, provide support for it. So after this, the researchers went back and 2 days later, assessed the students based on what they remembered from that passage. So the read and study group who did no writing remembered 5% of what they had read 2 days later. The comprehension question group remembered 29%. So that's a huge jump. The summary writing group remembered 39%, and the analytic writing group remembered 50%. So some of the big takeaways here are that really getting students to do any sort of writing about what they read is going to be extremely impactful in terms of what they retain and understand. And then the other takeaway is that the more we get students to do this kind of manipulation and transformation of ideas, the more deeply they're going to understand what they read and the more they're going to be able to remember it. So, in your classroom, that really means asking questions that require students to use evidence from the text, but that force them to somehow transform or manipulate what they've read. So typically these are questions that fall into your depth of knowledge 3 or 4. They're questions that ask students to compare and contrast ideas, that ask them to evaluate and assess arguments, that ask them to form their own arguments based on what they've read. Here you can see 2 questions from Actively Learn. So we always try to include one of these meaty DOK 3 or 4 questions at the end of our assignments. So the first one is a nonfiction social studies text that asks students, was foreign policy after World War II focused more on collaboration or competition between the world superpowers? So, students have read this textbook article about this topic, and now we want them to actually form their own argument using evidence from the text. And the second question at the bottom is from the short story, The Landlady, that asks students, using evidence from the text, predict what will happen to Billy. In both of those instances, we're really asking students to transform and manipulate what they've read and create something new, whether it's an argument or, sort of the next chapter in that story. And we're really asking them to deepen their understanding of what they've read. When we ask students to think deeply, to put in that time to craft their own ideas, we really need to make that effort meaningful by providing students with timely feedback and ensuring it gets put to use. So what I mean by timely feedback is, ideally it's feedback that comes while students are still learning, when the material that they're working with is still fresh in their minds and will be most impactful to them. And ensuring it gets put to use is really, giving students an opportunity to take your feedback and continue the learning process using your guidance. So the teacher benefit here is that the feedback that you've provided will be put to use in a visible way. I'm sure that all the teachers here have had the experience of providing grades and comments on a student paper and really wondering, is the student actually going to read these comments that I've spent my weekend writing for them? Are they going to refer back to those comments on the next response paper that they write? And if you include your feedback as part of your formative assessment while students are still learning, you know that it's going to be put to use and acted upon. And the student benefit is, of course, just more learning growth, because feedback is extremely impactful in terms of student learning. I once attended a really great webinar with Susan Brookhart, who's one of the thought leaders on effective feedback. And the quote she used was, give feedback that feeds forward rather than looking back into the morgue. So when we give feedback on student work that is already complete, so this is your summative assessment, this is no longer your draft, it is just your final work. It's students are much less likely to really read and put that feedback into use. But if students are getting feedback on a draft of something, and then they can incorporate it and improve their work, it is much more useful to them and is much more impactful for their learning. So typically, the kind of structure that you want to follow with your feedback is, students are working on a task, they get feedback, they incorporate that feedback, and then they get the grade, as opposed to, working on the task and then boom, getting a grade with feedback. So we really want to make sure that feedback comes in during that formative process. And in Actively Learn, we enable teachers to provide feedback and to students and give them a chance to revise based on that feedback. So here's my little grading panel. My student Rudy has written this response to my question, and I just don't think that he provided enough evidence there. So I'm going to write this comment for him. Rudy, please try to include evidence with your example. What do you think is missing? What do you think is insufficient there? And I'm going to allow revision. So I'm basically going to send this back to Rudy. And he's going to get a little notification and be able to read my comment and try again. And what makes this so impactful, and this is one of our most loved features on Actively Learn, is because teachers know that they're giving feedback that students are going to be very motivated to read and put into action. And students love this feature as well because they really do want to improve. They want to have a second chance to make this answer better. One bonus, anytime we give students an opportunity to revise their work, is to ask them to explain their initial misunderstanding. You could say, okay, maybe you provided the wrong answer the first time around. In your revision, I'll allow the revision, but you have to tell me, where your misunderstanding was the first time that you submitted this answer. That's a great way to encourage student metacognition and help students develop some of those richer, deeper skills of identifying their own misunderstandings. Third strategy for using writing to deepen comprehension gets to that idea of metacognition and learning. So strategy number 3 is to have your students annotate strategically. So there's various different ways of implementing annotation skills. The overall benefit of those different strategies is that students are better prepared for discussion and summative writing assignments. So they're just more prepared. They know what the purpose of their reading was. They're coming in with a set of notes, and they can respond more quickly to discussion questions. They already have some structure and some ideas crafted for their summative writing assignments. And the student benefit is just more cognitive engagement with the text. So you're, making sure that you're monitoring your comprehension as you read. You're really thinking about what matters in this text. And you're also developing some of the thinking skills of an expert reader, which are so useful. So I included an image here of maybe a kind of a classic, I would call this a general or maybe even generic annotation strategy, where students are pulling out important ideas and supporting details, monitoring their comprehension, connecting what they're reading to what they already know. This is one great way to get students started and try to build some of those skills of, hey, this is how you want your brain to think while you're interacting with text. What's nice about doing this digitally is that, we can make sure to put some of those annotation categories front and center for students. We can make those annotation strategies visible to the teacher so that teachers can provide feedback on students' annotations. So here is a little video of Actively Learn. So here I am as a student. I've highlighted text. I'm going to take a note. Here's my little annotation. And in the drop-down categories, you see the same categories that you just saw on the previous screen. So here's, is it important? Is it a keyword or detail? Am I showing that I understand an important idea? Is this something unfamiliar? And so forth. So, it's just a nice way to remind students of what we want them to be paying attention to as they read and they annotate. And these are fully customizable, so whatever annotation strategy you have for your students, you can customize those categories for them. Another option for an annotation strategy is to make it more specific to the individual assignment and the purpose for reading. So you can ask students to annotate portions of the text that align to your objective or that will help to prepare them for future discussion or writing. So here are some assignment directions from the short story, The Landlady. And as you read the story, ask yourself, how can initial appearances be deceiving? And I'm also telling students that, hey, it will be helpful to highlight and make note of parts of the story that show that something is different from how it seemed at first. So I'm telling them exactly what I want them to be highlighting and annotating as they go. And this is going to be useful for them in terms of preparing them to answer my final question at the end. And in terms of, having that discussion that we're going to have after the text about these initial appearances and what was maybe ironic or surprising about this story. All of the directions and assignments in Actively Learner are customizable. So even if you find something in our catalog that you really want to teach and you want to integrate your annotation strategy, you can always add that little that guidance for your students about what to annotate. And as they go through, you can see their annotations, you can respond to them, you can integrate them into your discussion to make them meaningful. The other nice thing is that students can use their annotations and their answers to short answer questions to write response papers. This is an example of the Actively Learn Google Doc add-on, where students are going to be able to basically see all of their answers to questions as well as their annotations and basically pop them into a Google Doc. I have seen teachers do some very clever backwards planning where, they know that ultimately students will be writing a response paper about irony across a series of short stories, for instance. And so, teachers will embed questions that really get at moments of irony and then ask them to annotate instances of irony in the text. And so when students then go to write their final paper about irony, they can leverage their answers to those questions and all of their highlights and notes, which makes it much easier for them to get started and to remember, oh yeah, in that short story I read, right, I remember highlighting this, I remember thinking about this, or this is what we talked about in the class. And it makes that writing much easier for students. Fourth strategy I want to cover is having students refer back to their prior writing to see how their thinking has changed. And so this really gets at the metacognition piece of students thinking about their learning and thinking about their reading. The big student benefit here is correcting misconceptions, having a greater awareness of the learning process, and recalling knowledge. So the reason that metacognition matters so much for students is that students who are more strategic in their learning tend to have improved learning outcomes. So as one example, maybe the student who can look back on their response paper and think, oh gosh, I really enjoyed having those annotations at hand to write my final paper. Next time I read, I need to be annotating because this is really going to help me as a scaffold. That student is going to be more efficient and successful in their learning and writing. Than the student who doesn't take that extra step to think about, well, okay, what strategy did I use here and did it help me or not? Secondly, expert readers engage in metacognitive thinking without realizing it. As expert readers, when we interact with the text, we're asking ourselves questions, we're monitoring our comprehension, we're evaluating how new pieces of information fit within our existing schemas. And so we want students to develop those same patterns of thinking. And lastly, metacognition helps students learn more deeply in terms of the connections that they make and the prior knowledge that they engage. There's a few different ways to help students activate their metacognition as they read and write. One strategy takes place at the individual assignment level. So one thing you can do is to ask students to share their thinking about a topic prior to reading via a poll or an ungraded short answer question, and then ask them if their thinking has changed at the end. So particularly for kind of explainer articles, or maybe articles that kind of are more argumentative or surprising, it can be really fun to kind of have students go through that process of, okay, where was I before I read this article, and where am I now? And how has my thinking changed? And how did that happen? You know, what was it in this article that really surprised me, or that I didn't know about before, or, you know, that reshaped my thinking? Excuse me. And another way to activate students' metacognition is to take more of the longer view. So this can happen during a one-on-one, or, you know, some periodic check-in that you have with students when you review their writing over the course of a unit or a semester, and reflect on how their writing and thinking have changed. So in Actively Learn, in my student data, I can see all of the students' writing over a given time period. And I can sit down with the student and we can actually have a conversation about, well, you know, are there patterns that you're seeing in terms of how your writing has evolved from day one to, you know, day 180? You know, what are you seeing in terms of the grades and just, you know, the way that you're expressing your ideas? That can be extremely useful to students in showing them how their thinking is developing, and getting to some of those metacognitive strategic thinking that we want them to be doing. You know, maybe it's something along the lines of, well, you know, over the course of the semester, I'm really using more textual evidence in my responses, or, you know, I'm really explaining how how the evidence I'm using fits into my argument. And those can be very rich and informative conversations with students. And the last piece that I wanted to touch on was collaboration. So giving students opportunities to respond to each other's writing and notes asynchronously. You know, I think one of the things that we most lament about remote learning is losing opportunities to have in-class discussions. You know, teachers and students love discussions. It's often, you know, students' favorite part of the day is getting a chance to talk to each other, to think together and work together. But there is an advantage to asynchronous written conversation. For the teacher, you get more student participation. You know, unless you're being really thoughtful in how you structure your in-class discussions, it can be very challenging to get every student to participate and have their voice heard. You know, some students are shyer and they're more reluctant to raise their hand and speak. Some students just need more time, and they struggle to kind of just catch up to the rest of the group. You know, it's like, they finally formulated and articulated their incredible thought, and, you know, the conversation has already moved. So asynchronous conversation gives all students an opportunity to participate, because they can do it at their own speed. They can have more of that time to look up words, to translate words. And so the student benefit there is really just having that additional time to articulate their thinking, to maybe look at how some of their peers are responding, and have models of participation. So yeah, so I mean, I think that is one great example of, you know, how technology can actually help, and particularly in a remote learning scenario. And here in the screenshot, you can see a discussion thread within Actively Learn of, you know, one student asking in a shared annotation a question about examples of, I think these were myths, Greek myths, and then other students kind of responding to it. And I think this largely makes it more meaningful and interesting for students too, if they can see that they're interacting with their peers as they're reading and having some of that shared experience that I'm certain that they miss when they're not in the classroom. So I've, wanted to have an opportunity to answer any other questions that may have been coming up during our presentation, that may have come up in the chat. Tessa or Melissa, are you seeing anything that I should touch on?
Yeah, go ahead, Tessa.
Yeah, I'd say one of the biggest things some people have asked about is pricing information. I think you have on the last slide just advice to reach out to info@activelylearn.com for that information. And that was the biggest one. And some folks are asking about the Google add-on, but for those folks, I have been posting the link to more information about that. Yeah, so those are the big trends we're seeing here.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Yes, so if you have any questions after today's presentation, feel free to reach out to info@activelylearn.com. That is our general, email where you can ask questions about pricing or any kind of support questions around how do I get started? How do I learn more about the Google Doc add-on? How do I get to that grading view where I can see students writing across time to have those one-on-ones with them? And you can find any of that information there. You can also create your free account for Actively Learn at activelylearn.com. So a lot of the features that I've been showing you, including those higher order thinking questions, the ability for students to annotate strategically, categorize their annotations, respond to one another within the text, are available on our free account. So I highly encourage you to create one if you haven't already. Yes, thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed, hopefully sharing some ideas that might be helpful, particularly in this semester as many classrooms are remote. Yeah.
So thank you, Dr. Natalie Saaris. I think it's always, we're all thinking right now, how do we increase engagement in this virtual platform that the majority of us are living in? And it's just such a great tool, and to have these insights on specific strategies that we can implement with our students is really, really helpful. So I just want to thank everybody for attending today. We will follow up with an email with additional resources that Actively Learn has put together for you. We also have many free resources on our Lexplore website as well. I want to encourage you to join us again for another session regarding Actively Learn, which is going to be on August 19th. And that's specifically looking at strategies and how to support students in mixed ability classrooms. We also have 2 webinars happening next week addressing the topics of dyslexia and social emotional well-being and assistive technology in writing using Microsoft tools that are free and available to you. So thank you so much, Dr. Saaris, for your generosity of time and helpful tools. And again, please head over to both of our websites and our social media sites. Begin to follow us and see some resources that can help you in the classroom, whether that be physically in the classroom or coming from home. So thank you so much and have a beautiful day.
And Melissa, I'm not sure if you're logging out, but the only last thing I think people would like to have research them is that you will be emailing them the presentation afterwards and the slides. And then there's been questions about whether or not there's a PD certificate.
Yeah, those are all both great questions. Thanks for bringing that up, Tessa. Yeah, so you can email me directly at melissa.lazaro@lexplore.com. I will be sending an email out to you in the next 48 hours with a link to the recording. So if you want to share that with colleagues, friends, or family, and if you need a certificate, I'm happy to send that over to you. Again, that's Melissa, MELISSA, .Lazaro, LAZARO @lexplore.com. More than happy to provide that for you. So if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out. And if you didn't capture Actively Learn's information, I'll be sure to pass that on if you email me as well. So have a great day. We hope to see you next week at our webinars or perhaps the following week with another session from Actively Learn.